to Women Lit Unbound. I'm Kiski Holwerda, Program Director, and I'd like to welcome you to this live Women Lit lunch hour with Eimear McBride in celebration of her new novel, Strange Hotel. I know we have some viewers who are new to Women Lit, so I want to take a quick moment to thank you all for joining us. Women Lit is a community designed to elevate female voices through meaningful conversation. All members receive access to these live virtual events and to our brand new monthly newsletter, Literary Lighthouse. There are a lot of other non-virtual member benefits when we return to in-person events, including member receptions, early access to tickets, and ticket discounts. And if you'd like to find out more, become a member or renew your membership, just visit womenlit.org. And thank you for your support. If you enjoy this conversation today, we'll be meeting again on June 4th with Pulitzer finalist Louise Aronson to discuss her latest book, Elderhood, a realistic and joyful redefinition of aging, with KALW journalist Janae Darden. Women Lit members will receive registration information straight to their email and can always contact us at womenlit@baybookfest.org with questions. Now, speaking of questions, we will be taking a few audience questions at the end of the program. If you would like to ask Eimear a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There is also a chat function, which you are welcome to join. Finally, if you haven't yet, I encourage you to purchase a copy of Strange Hotel from one of our indie bookstore partners, which you can find on our website. And now, I am beyond excited to welcome Eimear McBride, award-winning author of A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, The Lesser Bohemians, and Strange Hotel, and Brooke Warner, author of Write On Sisters and fearless publisher at She Writes Press and SparkPress. Welcome, Eimear and Brooke.
Thank you. Yes. Hi, everyone. I am Brooke Warner. I'll be your moderator for this great discussion today with Eimear McBride. Like Kiski said, at the end of the talk, we'll have a chance to answer a few of your questions. So keep that in mind at any time during the program. If you have a question, we'd love for you to type it into the question box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Hopefully most of you know where it is. And we're excited to hear from you when I get through some of my questions. So hi, Eimear. So good to see you.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So your work has been compared to James Joyce and Samuel Beckett, two of the most celebrated Irish authors of all times, and you received the inaugural fellowship at the Samuel Beckett Research Center. So from looking at that, what I gathered is that you were tasked to creatively engage with Beckett's writing and ideas during that time. So I wanted to start by asking you how you feel about these comparisons, and if you were expected to create a work that engaged with Beckett's ideas in some sort of creative way.
Well, I mean, the comparison thing first, I suppose, you can't complain too much about being compared to Joyce and Beckett. But at the same time, it's something of a burden because people then expect you as a writer to have the same preoccupations as they did, or the same interests, or being keen to kind of follow in their footsteps. And while both the writers were certainly an influence on me, and Joyce very particularly, when I first set out writing, I don't feel that we are especially interested in the same things beyond an interest in language and form. And so often, I suppose, I think the comparisons are a kind of a shorthand for describing what I'm doing. I'm an Irish writer who's interested in language, so therefore I kind of belong to that, the club of oddities. But the fellowship then was really the first time I had engaged with Beckett in a long time, and I kind of couldn't resist the offer. And I mean, they were very open. So it was to basically come and spend a few days every month working in Beckett's archive, which is set in the little suburban town of Reading, which is a bit odd, in the middle of the Museum of Rural English Life. It's a bit of a strange place to go to read up on Beckett. But yes, but there it was, and a lot of the original works are there, and basically I could do what I wanted. All that was required was that at the end of that I would write something new that was in some way connected to the experience of spending time with Beckett's work.
And was that Strange Hotel, or was that a different project?
No, well, it was actually a different project. I wrote a series of short radio plays called Mouthpieces, which I recorded for Irish radio. And actually, Strange Hotel, I started to write in the kind of the intervals between going to Reading as a way to kind of relieve myself of the effort and the weight of Beckett, which was weighing down on me. Because, of course, I was going to the archive a few times a month, but also I was constantly reading all the Beckett that I hadn't read before. And, it's great, but it's not easy. It's weighs on the soul somewhat, a lot of Beckett. So I thought, well, I'll start writing this, what I thought was going to be a short story. And this will be my escape from Beckett. It'll be something completely different. But of course, by the time I got to the end and it was a novel and I reread it, I just thought, oh, damn it, I can just see the influence of Beckett all over it. So much for the escape.
That does fill in some holes, though, because you described Strange Hotel as a surprise, and now I can see that you were writing a story, it sounds like, and suddenly you realized you had a book. So what is it like to realize that something is a book when you thought it wasn't, and when did you know? I mean, was it just about the length, or was it some other indication?
I think I realized that it was going to be more than a story when I got to the end of the first section, Avignon, and realized that wasn't going to be the end, that there was more, because I was, even though I was kind of winding it down, bringing it to that section to its conclusion, I could feel other ideas about this woman and other places bubbling up, and I wasn't really sure how far that would go. And originally it was 4 parts, and now it's 6 parts.
Okay.
But yeah, so it was a surprise, and but also kind of nice, because it was in a way a little bit like writing what it was like when I wrote A Girl as a Half-Formed Thing, which is to say that it was kind of written completely in private, with no one knowing about it, with no expectation placed on it. No, I didn't sell it. There was no one breathing down my neck for the manuscript. It was, in a way, accidentally recreating the kind of the perfect conditions to write a book in, where there's no pressure and there's no expectation. You don't even think you yourself are, that's what you're doing for a long time, and you're, you've got the privacy and the time to fail, which of course is the most important thing to be able to do.
All right. That does sound lovely, especially in light of a lot of pressure coming from other places. In Strange Hotel, I noticed that many reviews called it enigmatic. And by definition, that means mysterious, puzzling, or difficult to understand. And I'm guessing that this, from having read it, that's by design somewhat. We find the protagonist in a series of hotel rooms over this multi-year period, and it does feel that the point is to lose sense of time and place, and to show how we can and do exist differently and singularly when we're removed from the contexts of our lives. So the Guardian review said the book lacked context. Is this lack of context, in fact, one of its organizing principles?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the game of it was really to see how much you could get away with withholding. How much do we need to know about a character in order to be willing to pursue them through however many short, pages that the book goes along with? I mean, I think I really wanted to just lift her out of time and out of place, and so that it's really a book about the internal life. It's a book that is, as opposed to my first 2 novels, it's a book that is thinking about feeling rather than filled with feeling, and that was, a very conscious decision to kind of step away, from all the kind of the feeling of hysteria there seems to be in the world at the moment, where everyone is busily expressing maximum emotion at all times, outrage, love, admiration, disgust. Everything is kind of ramped up, and I suppose I feel, and I wanted to explore this as well in the book, that I'm now in middle age, and all this kind of endless hysterical kind of emoting didn't really feel like something I could connect to, and I thought how interesting to write a character who isn't involved in that, who is really about thought, and who is actively using thought as a way to distance herself from emotion. And emotion leaks through, but she's not interested in sharing all her deep feelings. She's actually actively trying to keep them at bay.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I glean that that's frustrating for some readers, and and
I don't make it easy.
No, you don't make it easy, and it also seems like that's kind of something that you're perhaps intentionally doing. You're not bound to conventional rules or prose or anything for that matter, and it can be challenging to read. You acknowledge, and since you seemingly want it to be that way, I'm saw where you were saying, you want literary reads to be challenging and perhaps expect them to be, and want the reader to work a bit. So what kind of reading experience do you imagine for your reader when they sit down to read a Eimear McBride novel?
Well, I suppose what I want, and maybe this is not so different to what every other writer wants, is for the reader to approach it knowing that they have to really engage with it, that this is not a book that they can skim through for the best bits and get the gist of, that if they don't read it, every word of it, they will miss something. They will really miss something. And that in a book like Strange Hotel particularly, the process is all. It's not about plot. It's not about getting to an end point. It's not about a moment of revelation. It's, everything is about the process of going through, thinking about thinking, examining what it is to be who she is, and I suppose I don't see that there's any harm in that, and I hope that there is enough in the book to keep the reader entertained, because I also think it's a much funnier book than my first two books, that she is aware that she is driving herself crazy with her incessant nitpicking and her kind of returning to themes and ideas and not getting any further. And the whole point of the book is that she is stuck within herself. She's created a cycle in which she can only think about herself in a particular way and can't get out of it, and is frustrated by it, but is also unwilling to step beyond that and to go into a new kind of life.
It's fascinating because it strikes me that some of the criticisms that have been lobbed at the book are the very things that you pretty much effectively wanted to do, because there's some readers accused you of being solipsistic, and it prompted me to look into what does that even mean in literature? And it's basically the desire to distance the world. And one of the primary themes seems to be aloneness, loneliness, escape from the world, escape from the past. And your point in response to that was that it was a kind of a gendered accusation, which I agree with, and that readers call it out in women writers in ways that they wouldn't men writers. Do I have the right take on this? And I was just wondering if you would say a bit more.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, are we seriously in this day and age saying we're done with novels that are about thinking? That's done now, is it? This is the entire history of literary fiction from the inception of the novel have been books thinking about what it means to be a person, and for suddenly that to be unacceptable, I think is actually quite a disturbing trend, and it's become more and more prevalent where a book is not allowed to be about thinking. It's not allowed to offer a challenge or a puzzle for the reader. It's not allowed to try and activate their interests in different ways. It's not allowed to expect a commitment or a concentration of even a short amount of time, that you're supposed to be on all the time, entertaining, throwing out the big moments, giving everyone the big feels. And I find that very disturbing. And I think solipsism is, no one ever called Beckett solipsistic. Right. I think it's something that is particularly gendered, because the idea of a woman who's thinking about herself, not thinking about others, is something which is particularly still taboo, and that we must always be demonstrating our willingness to offer and to give rather than to withhold. I think, come on now, grow up. I'm not willing to go down this route, and I know that is the trend, but I'm holding out in hope of better times.
Well, good for you. Yes. And that, I mean, it does kind of go back to the point that I'm saying. I think there is a lot of sort of accusation and criticism, and it felt like this is what she's trying to do, so it's effective, and people have feelings about that, which I think could be a good thing, a good conversation. Certainly, I mean, there is a lot of self-reflection on the part of your protagonist. She has memories of the past, lots of alluding to pain and trauma. She analyzes her thoughts. We see her mulling over whether to do things or not. I mean, you're talking about this, so kind of this obsession space that she gets into, and she doesn't dwell, as I think many novels do, on the meanings or motivations behind sex or a one-night stand. And in that way, I thought it felt very feminist. The protagonist is, in fact, quite empowered. So you wrote or said, either way, about her actions, yes, the risk is always there and nothing terrible happens to her in this book, but it could really, really easily. So could you say more about how you wanted your reader to interpret your protagonist? I mean, you certainly began to talk about that, but why not have something bad happen to her?
I think, in the past, I've obviously written a lot about women and sexual trauma and surviving or not surviving it. And I suppose I felt it was time to look at sex in a different way, and that actually casual sex is so usually portrayed as some kind of catastrophe, particularly for middle-aged women. And I just thought this is untrue, and actually women can enjoy casual sex, and it needn't have massive emotional ramifications for them. That I don't, does the author feel any desire at all to punish her by letting something terrible happen to her. And I really just wanted to explore this whole other side of female sexuality, which is, very rarely allowed to rear its head, which is kind of seen as too male, as the kind of, shag them and then leave them, or just, and she wants to have the sex. She enjoys the sex that she has, but she also wants them to go so she can just have a bath or go to bed or have a cigarette or have a glass of wine, so she's not looking for someone. This is not the point of the book, which I suppose, again, was in some ways related to A Girl Is a Half One Thing, which, again, was a book that wasn't about a female character looking for someone to love them or save them, but, using sex in a very different way for different things. And I suppose I'm kind of just very tired of this, of kind of sex as catastrophe for women. And, I think we don't have to bow to those stereotypes. And so why should we?
Yes. And thank you for breaking that up a bit, because it is refreshing. And, hotel rooms are weird places, strange places, as the title alludes to, and you clearly capture all the ways in which they're the same. No matter what city you go to, they are kind of creating this alternate reality. You push pause on your real life, and then you have this space to, like your protagonist, think, drink, have anonymous sex, whatever you want to do. So this is a two-part question. What gave you the inspiration to set your character in a series of hotel rooms, and what's unique about hotels that allows you to explore so much within this container?
Well, I suppose first off, what I was interested in was telling the story through her. And although a lot of the book is written in the third person, it's not a traditional third person. It's a very close third person in which actually the reader is privy to what she's thinking about as she's thinking about it. So they don't get any of the history or the context of why she's thinking the things that she's thinking. They just have to try and pick up what's going on as it's going through her mind, which is, maybe accounts for the slightly unforgiving quality of the narrative. You've got to watch out for the clues. And I suppose that being thrown back on herself so that she's really only able to think about herself and her past seemed easier to do in an anonymous place. And so the hotel room is, I've spent a lot of time in hotel rooms in recent years, and initially, it's very exciting, and you kind of rush in and wonder what was in the minibar and what were the toiletries, but over time, it stops being glamorous and interesting, becomes boring, it becomes lonely, and you realize it's just a place to go, to wait, to do the thing you came to do, and then to wait to leave. And that leaves you a lot of time alone with yourself, in which you are not able to be distracted by the stuff that's in your life. So, when you're sitting in your house, you're thinking, oh, I should go hang out the washing, or I should, clean the bathroom, or I should tidy the attic now that I've got a few hours to all this kind of stuff that leads you back into life doesn't exist in a hotel room. You're just kind of there. And if you are someone who isn't particularly engaged in the lives of others, who's just kind of getting on with stuff, what's there to disturb you from those thoughts? So it just seemed to create that sense of isolation that I felt the character needed to be explored in that way.
Yeah, it's effective. And it makes me think it's so true that you're so excited when you're in your 20s and going to a hotel room and versus in your 40s when it's like, oh God, it's a very different experience. And clearly what she's grappling with to some extent is her age and how far into her life she is. So thank you. And compared to your first two books, readers have felt like this one is more removed, less intense. Her emotions have cooled, one reviewer said. I wasn't sure if they were talking about you or your protagonist, frankly. So I asked the question, is this true?
I'm a female writer, so they probably mean both, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's another question we can get to. This thing that people do of always wondering whether your fiction must be true. But you are bringing a less intense and raw emotion to Strange Hotel, it seems, over your first two books. So does this speak to a kind of evolution for you in your own writing, or is this just a singular effort that shouldn't indicate anything about future books?
Yeah, I don't think this is a sign of this is the way it's going to be. I wanted to do something different. I felt, Girl is a Half-One Thing is a very particular type of book. Lesser Bohemians was in some ways similar, but moved on. And it just felt right to try something different. And I suppose I was keen to think about having used language in the past as a way to kind of pin the character to the wall and to allow the reader to live through those characters, to not be able to escape them, to be intensely kind of emotionally involved, and almost as though what's happening was happening inside the reader themselves. I thought, well, it would be interesting to think about how language works differently in middle age, and that, because of course, when you're young, you are willing the world to happen to you. You are waiting for experience, and you have so little of it that you open yourself to it, and it comes rushing in, and it does great things to you, and it does terrible things to you. But when you get older, the world cannot get in quite so easily. You know where the dangers lie. You know where you need to be careful. You know where you want to protect yourself. You know what you're willing to go through and what you just feel you haven't got the energy for anymore. And how could that be reflected in language? And that obviously meant that language had to be used in a very different way to the first two books. And I suppose that then accounts for the much greater formality of the language, and absolutely the lack of kind of rampant emotion everywhere, is that she's not that person, and she has no desire to be that person who is having great emotional experiences. And so the language became much more formal, and the language became about distance, about trying to how do you keep people at bay with words? How do you, the more polite you are, the more formal you are, the further distance you put between yourself and another person, the more, you don't just say thanks, you say thank you very much indeed, that's very kind of you, is your most polite way to say it. But that's also a way of keeping people far, of not putting yourself on the same level as them, and of just keeping that safe place. And so So it's, as with the other books, the way that it is written is, the style is dictated by the content, is dictated by the style in a way. It's not, I don't feel like this is how I'm now going to write books from now on. This is how this book had to be written. And I think it felt like a worthwhile experiment. And I don't know what will be next. So,
which is perfect. I hope that you have something very freeing and, lots of possibility for whatever comes. But thank you for explaining that. It's fascinating and certainly resonates. So you've said, I'm going to quote you again here, there are things that invade you that you can't control no matter how protective you are. There are things that will just go through all of that. Those are the things I'm interested in catching. I was struck by this, which is why I wrote it down. And I wondered if you could say more about the things that will just go through all of that. Are these thoughts, or were you talking about things like grief and loss that have informed your own view of the world?
Yeah, I think I was really talking about kind of the big emotional experiences of life, and grief is something that I've had, unfortunately, quite a bit of experience with, and certainly earlier on in my life. And in Strange Hotel, I suppose I was also interested in the legacy of grief, the life of grief, the life after the moment when the terrible thing happens, when you, at first you think, I can't survive. But of course, over time you do survive. But it never goes away. It becomes something else, and it moves inside you, and it evolves, and it jumps out at odd times. And I suppose that's where the kind of the drama, if you could even call it that, at Strange Hotel is the things that cut through all her efforts to be all right, to be cut off, to be distant and cold and in control of her emotions. That grief cuts through anyway, and when it does, even though that grief is, at the beginning of the book, it's 10 years since it occurred, since the bereavement occurred, that it can be savage despite all your efforts. Yeah.
And then you catch it through language, really, and especially in this book, more than trying to explain what happened. I mean, I think it's interesting because it's clear that she's had loss and grief and trauma even, and yet we, I guess, can just overlay our own experiences or what collective female experiences those might be, or collective human experiences.
Yeah, and I think that kind of stripping away all of those markers of her identity, of not going, well, her name's Kathy and she lives in Seattle and she drives this kind of, by just not telling the reader anything, I hopefully allows for a certain universality of experience of that, you instead of thinking of all the ways in which you may be like this character or you may not be, instead you kind of access her at a deeper level, and that sense of her humanity overrides and becomes more important than the ways in which you can identify with her or not.
Interesting. Yeah. So this is pivoting a bit, but you are not afraid to take on the establishment, which I really appreciate. You're not afraid to take on people's judgments or accusations either. So at a public reading, a man challenged you and asked you if you found it easy to objectify men, to which you said yes. And he seemed displeased. He wanted a different answer, clearly. But you said, yes, I already answered your question. And then this is just going to give another example of how you take on these kinds of pushbacks. In another interview, you said, I think there's a lot of angry old men in publishing and in the media who really object to having to take this foolish female business seriously, and they don't really hide it, and they don't have to, and that's a problem. So it seems like you're countering this problem by speaking up and speaking out on behalf of yourself, of course, but I see that as on behalf of women and women writers specifically. How important is it to you to push back and speak up in order to affect change for women writers, or is that, even part of your orientation to it?
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult because in some ways I don't feel as though I push back for women writers or because I'm a woman writer. I push back because I object to art being strangled by idiocy, which happens all the time. And it just so happens that a lot of the idiocy comes from these kind of dumb, settled old guys, and they write out to attack women particularly. So it's out of necessity rather than, an ideological desire to do battle with the male establishment. And because, really, I think art comes first. And if you're using my sex as a means to ignore what I'm saying, as a way to diminish what I am trying to achieve, the end that I'm trying to get to, then that's something that I don't want to, get into a row about it, but I will if I have to. And it's so tiresome. I mean, I think that kind of the wonderful Anne Enright said recently, how completely infuriating it is that women have to spend so much time fixing a problem which they didn't create.
Right.
But, and I feel that, and I feel like, I'm asked these questions all the time and I have to answer them all the time, and I'd much rather be talking about art and literature. But where we are in this time, in this point in history, these are the questions that have got to be answered. And I don't see why I shouldn't be forthright, because they will attack whether I'm forthright or not forthright. So I might as well, say what's on my mind.
Well, and it does feel like I talk to a lot of women writers, of course, and there's always that guy at the event, who's actually coming at you wielding a bit of a gotcha moment, and then you're like, no, actually, I'm fine with objectifying men, and they're stunned because that's not the answer that they wanted. They wanted to kind of trick you or get you.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
so
that's exactly what happened in that event. That he was kind of delighted with himself that
right.
he had kind of pinned me down, and now I have been caught objectifying men. Of course, I don't think the book objectifies men at all, but it does treat men in a way that men don't like to think that they are treated, which is as unimportant, and as a sexual object and nothing more. But this for him was like his moment to show what a hypocrite I was, and I just thought, I don't want to. One, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of time engaging with this. So I just said, yes, it is. And then he came back and said, well, you haven't answered my question. I said, yes, I have. And he came back again and said, well, I'm, not very happy with that answer. And I said, well, I really don't care. Which he was pulped by, as though somehow being a writer, it's like being a shop, and he deserves satisfaction. Like, the only thing that I owe a reader is that I do my best work. Whatever that is, that's what I owe the reader, is that when they buy a book of mine, they know that I have given it everything that I have to give. And no one is entitled to more than that. No one is entitled to, answers and explanations and apologies. And no, that's not how it works. The transaction is, I give you my best, and you buy it, and then you like it, you don't like it, but that's nothing to do with me.
Yeah, well, thank you, because I think it's a great model. I mean, there are a lot of writers who will be listening, and women writers in particular, and I think learning how to answer these kinds of questions at events is unfortunately part of being a writer in the public-facing part of what you have to do.
It really is. It really is. And it was something I had to learn very quickly because, Girls Are Half One Thing was published when I was 36. I had never done a literary event. I didn't know anything about so I had to learn on my feet very quickly. And at first I was so grateful all the time, the way women are supposed to be, of course, so grateful that everyone's, interested, and I have to say yes to everyone, and I have to be nice to everyone. But over time, of course, you realize that there are, and you see it happening to yourself, and you see it happen to other women, where there's always the guy who's trying to catch you out, who's always trying to have the last word, who's trying to point out where you're falling down, where you're somehow not Joyce, and and the cheek of you thinking that you could be Joyce without really engaging with what you're doing. So I think anyone who's really engaged with my work knows that A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing is not an attempt to write Ulysses. I'm not interested in the things that Joyce is interested in, but it's a stick. It's a stick that's very easy to beat me with. And that happens, and usually a lot with very kind of serious male academics who, like to point out that, I'm nothing on the man himself. And again, I think with some criticisms of Strange Hotel, I do feel a frustration with critics who won't engage with the book on its own terms, and instead review the book they want to have read rather than review the book that was written. And see whether it succeeds or not on its own terms. But writing a review in which you say, well, imagine going to all those places, but not writing about about the cities.
Like getting ice cream and going out to dinner.
really, really missing the point of what the book is about. The book is not about, having fun in Auckland.
Indeed. Yes. And thank you. I mean, I read so many reviews and I found it fascinating. I mean, there was a little bit of a beat about that, people feeling clearly frustrated, wanting it to be, to your point, something that it's not. My last question before we'll turn to the audience questions, this is, again, a place where I've seen you in your response, a bit of frustration or even defensiveness around, if I had wanted to write a memoir, I would have written a memoir. And I think this happens. I said we'd go back to this, and we are. It does seem to happen, again, more to women writers, that when you write a novel, people wonder what parts are true or assume it's all true. I think the same thing happens with memoir. People kind of wonder which parts are fictionalized, or is, so there's all this speculation. Do you feel defensive in that question? I mean, I guess the point I'm trying to get to is when someone asks that question, what do you feel?
Well, I think there's two things. I mean, one is, yes, it is a question that is, mostly asked of women, based on the assumption that, women are not capable of taking the great leaps of imaginative, intellectual thought that male writers are. But actually, there's another part, which is that I think people with my writing feel like they've had a big emotional experience. Certainly with the first two books. And I think perhaps they feel they want that to be validated. Like they want to feel like they felt that because that was a literally truthful fiction of something, rather than the kind of truth that literature is, which is fiction, but it was a way of accessing deeper truths. So in a way, I sometimes think that it is a form of confusion where people feel like if it's not literally true, if this didn't literally happen to me, McBride, they've been duped somehow. And that's not the case, because, literature is about finding a way to truth through lies, essentially. And that's the nature of the beast. But I think, again, the publishing industry has been its own enemy in this kind of endless pushing of trying to push writers into saying that works of fiction are memoir, in trying to kind of push the narrative that it's only by literal truth that we can have truthful experiences of work. And I think it creates an odd atmosphere, but I don't think it's I don't know, the woman element of it annoys me. But the other side, I think, well, I take that as a compliment, actually, that you feel that something affected you so strongly that it must be true. And it is true. It's just not true in the way that you think that it is.
Right. Universally true. Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And let's see what people are thinking and feeling out there. I think we're going to bring Kiski on to moderate some questions.
Yes. Hello. So we have some audience questions. The first one, How did you find your strength? And what is your advice for women, especially female creatives who are trying to get out of this cycle of being nice?
I think for me, I came from failure, from a lot of failure, from 9 years of not being able to get my first book published and of kind of being told to go away. And so when the book was published and became so successful, I kind of got the fear a bit, the fear of like, oh, what if that happens again? And then I sort of realized, look, I've survived all of that. I've survived failure. So I know that I can, which kind of makes me free in a way. What will happen? What if I can't get published? I'm not going to die. And I know that I won't stop writing because, all of those years I kept on writing, even when I couldn't get out there. And I think it's the fear always of what's the worst thing that can happen that holds people back from being blunt. And what is the worst that can happen? What would they do? Pile on you, shout at you. I've had all of those things happen, and well, none of it's made any difference. It hurts, but it doesn't make any difference. When I sit down to write, I know that I will just write whatever it is that I want to write and that I have to write, no matter what's said. And what was the second part of the question?
Do you have any advice for women, or especially like female creatives, how to get out of that cycle, how to break the cycle of being nice?
I think whenever you feel guilty, remember that in that situation, most men will feel angry and feel that instead, and let that propel you on. Female anger is a great thing.
I love that. It is a great thing. Another question from the audience is the way you published Strange Hotel the way you started? Or did you try different ways to arrange it, different perspectives, point of views?
No, and it's pretty much how I started. And that's, with all my books, I like to discover as I go along. There's nothing planned. There's no kind of scheme set out. I don't know what the end point is. I don't know what it will be about. So, the reader discovers what the book is about at the same pace that I, as the writer, discovered what the book is about. Because, that's where the interest lies for me. If I already knew what was going to happen, why would I write it? And the perspective, I think, I initially started with the third person because I just thought, well, what would it be like to write in the third person? And then in the end, I found that I couldn't really write it in the traditional third person, that it ended up being this much more kind of intimate, secret surveillance third person instead.
Nice. What writers influenced you when you were growing up?
Well, Edna O'Brien, of course, was a huge influence on me. Reading her Country Girls trilogy in my early teens was the first time that I had read a writer talking about the body and about sex and about women and sexual desire existing in a woman. See, growing up in very religious, conservative Ireland in the 1980s, that was just not something that was open to women. And so reading her really kind of opened up the whole world. I just said, wow, there's a whole lot of stuff that's going on in women's lives that I don't know anything about, and I'd like to know more about that. So I think that, but also, and I suppose chimes in with Strange Hotel, was Thomas Mann in my late teens. The first time I read Death in Venice, it made such a huge impression on me. And so when I came to write Strange Hotel, I thought, yeah, Beckett, Joyce, be gone. Maybe now is the time to explore that kind of European influence a bit more. And I think, although Beckett is an influence on Strange Hotel, Thomas Mann is a bigger influence. And yeah, the idea of the kind of the self that's stuck really comes from Death in Venice.
Actually, funny that you mentioned Beckett. We had a listener wonder what Beckett novel you mentioned at the top. I don't know if you remember, but I'm going to toss in, if you were going to put together a Beckett reading list, what would be on?
I don't think I did mention Beckett. I think I was just talking about the archive, or maybe Murphy, because they have the manuscript of Murphy in Reading. And I would definitely have Murphy on, even though that's not really considered to be the proper post Epiphany Beckett. I think it's a good place to start. And but of course I could say what, but actually no. I think what is maybe a cause of too much suffering. But Malone Dies. All of those. I think those are. Yeah, because for years I hadn't read any Beckett novels at all. I only knew him through his plays. The novels, and still today you meet people who go, "Oh, I didn't realize he was a novelist at all." They're definitely worth a go. Ignore the early ones; they're terrible. But the later ones are good.
Nice. I also only knew him from his plays. Another question. What is it like writing for different mediums? Are there things you can explore more easily or differently in a script, like those radio shorts you mentioned, more so than a novel?
Yeah, that's, I've always considered myself a novelist and nothing else. And, I've only ever written short stories under duress when someone's kind of commissioned me and I felt I liked them so much I couldn't say no, or that I was so intrigued by the topic that I couldn't refuse. And I still don't really feel like I'm a short story writer, but writing the radio plays seemed in a way like a natural progression, because I think a lot of the language, that's actually been a really interesting experience and something that I hadn't expected to enjoy, having, suffering from the kind of the novelist disease of control freakery, in which you have to be in charge of every single thing that happens, to suddenly realize how much control you have to relinquish in order for a screenplay to work, was kind of, a bit, I didn't think that I would like it, but actually maybe my old kind of drama school days enjoyed doing something that was a little more collaborative for a change.
Eimear, it's interesting about the audiobooks, because I had another interview with a woman who's actually a spoken word artist, and they said that her publisher made her audition for her own audiobook. I'm curious, do you think it's your drama background that kind of lent you to be able to do that, or did they say anything about needing to audition, or were you a shoe-in?
No, well, I just said I wouldn't sell it if I couldn't read it. So they couldn't do the audiobook if it wasn't me. And luckily, after I did Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, I think I could say, well, look, if you're nervous, go and listen to this. And I think that it's quite a successful recording. So it kind of allays their fears now. And it's kind of a given. That
I also can't imagine anyone else being able to do the pacing of Girl is a Half-Formed Thing.
Yeah, well, there is that.
Yeah, what you were trying to do, and maybe only you know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there was a theatre version of A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing a few years ago, which was, which went very well and toured all over and came to New York and played in London and everywhere. And that was an interesting thing to go through, because I remember coming into rehearsals on the first day, having just finished recording the audiobook myself the week before, and about to start the read through and kind of meeting the actress and thinking, if she doesn't read this the way I want it to be read, we're going to have, problems. And she started to read, and she actually read it very differently to how I read it. But I could tell that she really understood it. Mm. And I thought, okay, this is different to what I would do. But actually, she has to make it her own, and she understands. She understands on a deeper level what it's about, and it's going to be okay, which it was. But it was hard to let go.
Oh my gosh, I imagine. Yeah. Kiski, do we have one or two more questions?
Yeah, I've got one more question. Which contemporary authors do you feel focus on and capture language in a way that feels new, exciting, or thoughtful?
Well, I suppose I'm in a constant state of intellectual love affair with Anna Schofield, whose book Bina is, I think, just come out here, but I think it's maybe out over there, has been for a while. And she's, again, an Irish writer, really from down the road from where I grew up, but is very engaged with form and with language. And this book Bina is about what it's like to lose a friend when you're a woman in kind of middle age, and it's a kind of grief that is so often ignored, but is so life-changing to those that it happens to. And so it's a very painful book, but it's also incredibly funny. And the way she uses language is just really startling and alive. It feels very alive. And I suppose I also really, really love Garth Greenwell. And I think, having written a book that was so much about sex myself with Lesser Bohemians, to read his books in which he really explores sex so well, I think I feel a kind of kinship with him, although, we're obviously working very different ways, but I think he's a really very extraordinary writer.
Eimear, thank you so much. And everyone, I encourage you to, the closing slide will include some of information about the indie bookstore partners that we have, Folio Books specifically, and of course, buy a copy of Strange Hotel, but also Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, and also the Lesser Bohemians, all of which are amazing. It's wonderful to read them all together in a short period of time, and then as I did dive into the reviews and just kind of wrestle with it all. So it was a wonderful opportunity. And Eimear, thank you. You're a delight. Thanks so much for being with us.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And I am Brooke Warner, and you have been listening and watching Women Lit Unbound. Thank you, everyone.